This video summarizes the narrative of Genesis chapter 8 from the Old Testament and provides a detailed analysis of the main interpretations from both the Catholic and Protestant churches, examining them from their respective theological perspectives. We will explore how central themes such as the restoration of the world after the flood, Noah's actions, and God's promise are understood and given theological significance within each tradition. Summary. Genesis chapter 8 describes the restoration of the world after the Great Flood and the new beginning for humanity. The narrative begins with God remembering Noah and all the living creatures in the ark as the waters that covered the earth for 150 days began to recede. This expression remembering signifies not merely recalling a memory, but God's active intervention, meaning God's renewal of mercy toward Noah and creation, and taking concrete action. God sent a wind, and by closing the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven, the waters gradually began to subside. This recession of the waters was a slow and gradual process, in contrast to the rapid onset of the flood. This suggests God's method of working, often in stages, when bringing about salvation. After 150 days of the waters diminishing, the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat. Then, after approximately 2.5 more months, the tops of the mountains became visible. Noah opened the window of the ark and first released a raven. The raven flew back and forth until the waters had completely dried up. Next, Noah released a dove 3 times to check the situation on the ground. The first dove returned without finding a resting place, but the second dove returned in the evening with a fresh olive leaf in its beak, indicating that the waters had receded and new life was sprouting. The third dove did not return, informing Noah that the ground was completely dry. Noah's act of gradually releasing the raven and doves was not out of mere curiosity but demonstrated his faith and obedient posture, patiently waiting for God's guidance and carefully confirming the conditions on the ground. Even after confirming that the ground was dry, he waited for a clear command from God and remained in the ark until the 27th day of the 2nd month of the 601st year. At God's command, Noah, his family, and all the animals exited the ark. Noah's first action in the new world was not to build their dwelling but to build an altar to the Lord and offer burnt offerings of all clean animals and birds. This act was an expression of Noah's deep gratitude and worship of God, establishing the universal lesson that worship of God should occupy a central place in the new beginning of humanity. God accepted Noah's offering as a pleasing aroma and promised in his heart never again to curse the ground because of humanity, nor to destroy all living creatures by a flood. This promise was made despite humanity's heart being evil from youth, demonstrating God's boundless mercy and patience. Furthermore, God promised that as long as the earth endures, the natural cycles of seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night would not cease, assuring God's continuous care and faithfulness to creation. Catholic interpretation. The Catholic Church interprets the account in Genesis chapter 8 by focusing on God's sovereign intervention, the themes of creation and recreation, and worship as a human response. Theological meaning of God's remembering. In Catholic interpretation, the expression God remembered Noah does not mean that God had forgotten Noah, God is omniscient and does not forget. Rather, the word remember in the Bible signifies that God is acting, demonstrating active engagement and faithfulness to covenants or promises previously made. This act of God's remembering is a turning point from judgment to salvation, indicating the resumption of God's mercy, reference to Catholic teaching if available, otherwise general theological understanding. This concept emphasizes a core tenet of Catholic theology, that God is not a passive observer but an active intervener in the relationship with creation. Since God's knowledge is understood as inseparable from God's living action in governing the world and fulfilling covenantal relationships based on that knowledge, this directly impacts the understanding of God's providence and God's response to human prayer. Themes of creation and recreation. As the receding of the flood waters is described, the passage stating that God sent a wind, Hebrew, ruach, to dry the earth is interpreted in parallel with the description of the initial creation in Genesis 1:2, the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. This wind is understood as the Holy Spirit or God's breath, and is seen as signifying an act of recreation by God. This interpretation emphasizes that God's Spirit consistently works as a creative force, bringing order out of chaos. Furthermore, the command "be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth" given again to Noah and the animals is a reaffirmation of the command given at the initial creation, Genesis 1:22, 1:28, symbolizing the renewal of life and the continuity of God's creative plan. The depiction of the world's restoration after the flood using the language and imagery of the first creation reinforces the concept of salvation history in Catholic theology. This suggests that God's salvation is not merely a recovery from destruction but a return to God's original creative intention, a re-establishment to a higher order. In Catholic theology, which teaches that God's actions have a consistent pattern and purpose, the flood was a judgment against sin, but the subsequent restoration shows that God has not abandoned his original blessings and plans for humanity and creation. Noah's sacrifice and God's response. Noah's first action upon exiting the ark, building an altar and offering burnt offerings of clean animals and birds, is emphasized as an act of deep gratitude and worship to God. This serves as a model for the proper human response to God's salvation. The expression that God smelled a pleasing aroma metaphorically indicates that God joyfully accepted Noah's pious act. Noah's sacrifice holds more meaning than just an act of thanksgiving. It symbolizes the beginning of a new relationship between God and humanity, laying the foundation for later Old Testament covenants and sacrificial systems. This interaction, suggesting God's concrete acceptance of human faith and devotion, carries deeper meaning within the context of the Catholic Church's understanding of the sacraments, especially the communion between God and believers in the Eucharist. This act becomes the basis for God's promise to continue his grace and patience despite human sinfulness. This reflects the Catholic teaching that human actions are important as a response to God's grace. Continuity of the natural order. In response to Noah's sacrifice, God promises, as long as the earth endures, seedtime and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. This promise assures the restoration of natural cycles and the maintenance of a stable order, demonstrating God's providence and constant care for creation. This promise shows that God's mercy transcends human sinfulness. The inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. This means that God is sovereign not only in judgment but also in sustainment and grace. This promise establishes a fundamental trust for human life and provides the basis for agriculture and social activity. It also connects to the concept of our common home in Catholic social teaching, which emphasizes human responsibility to respect, manage, and care for God's creation. 3. Protestant interpretation of the chapter. The Protestant Church deeply interprets Genesis chapter 8 from the perspective of God's covenant faithfulness, human faith and obedience, and the prefiguration of salvation through Christ. God's remembering and reliability. The expression "God remembered Noah," Genesis 8:1, is a central theme in Protestant interpretation. This phrase is not understood to mean that God literally forgot Noah, as such an interpretation would be inappropriate given God's omniscient nature. Instead, this remembering signifies that God actively executed a covenant previously made with Noah, Genesis 6:18, and began to intervene. This act of God provides great comfort to those who feel themselves in difficult circumstances. It demonstrates God's character as a faithful covenant partner who brings restoration after judgment. God's character and the flood narrative. The flood narrative, especially Genesis chapter 8, is believed to reveal several important aspects of God's character. God is a holy and righteous being who brings judgment against human evil and sin. But at the same time, God is a gracious and merciful being who preserves Noah's family and provides a time for repentance. Furthermore, God is depicted as a faithful being who keeps his promise to sustain creation and not destroy it again by flood, and as a sovereign creator who controls nature and brings both judgment and restoration. God's use of wind to dry the earth is understood as a sovereign instrument of God, similar to when God parted the Red Sea or brought the locusts. Noah's faith and obedience. Noah's actions after the ark rested on Mount Ararat are emphasized as demonstrating his faith, hope, and patience. Noah did not immediately leave the ark even when signs of dry land appeared, but carefully checked the situation by releasing the raven and doves. The dove's return with an olive leaf was a clear sign of new life and hope. Most importantly, Noah waited for a clear command from God, Genesis 8:15-16, even after the ground was completely dry before leaving the ark. This complete obedience is presented as a model of faith for believers, demonstrating patience in waiting for God's perfect timing. God's covenant and promise. Noah's first action upon exiting the ark was to build an altar and offer burnt offerings. This act of worship and thanksgiving is seen as the appropriate response to God's faithfulness. God accepted the offering as a pleasing aroma and solemnly promised never again to curse the ground or destroy all living creatures by flood. This promise was made despite the fact that the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, emphasizing that God's grace does not depend on human merit. Some Protestant interpretations, such as that of Spurgeon, suggest that this sacrifice, seen as a prefigurement of Christ's ultimate sacrifice, transformed the logic of God's judgment into the logic of mercy. This covenant guarantees that there will be no future global flood. This promise of God provides a foundational understanding in Protestant theology, that God's grace is sovereign and unconditionally given despite human sinfulness. Unchanging cycles of the natural world. God's promise includes the declaration, as long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. This signifies the restoration and continuity of the natural order, serving as a constant testimony to God's faithfulness and loving care for creation. Typological and broad theological applications. In Protestant interpretation, typological connections are often drawn between the events of Genesis chapter 8 and the work of Jesus Christ. For example, the ark resting on Mount Ararat on the 17th day of the 7th month is interpreted in parallel with the day of Jesus Christ's resurrection, the third day after Passover, the 17th day, suggesting that the faith of believers is based on the fact of Christ's resurrection. Furthermore, the dove returning to the ark without finding rest is seen as a symbol of souls in a sinful world who cannot find true rest returning to the ark, which is Christ. The entire flood narrative is viewed as a microcosm of the grand narrative of the Bible, showing God's work of redeeming, restoring, and renewing fallen creation through Christ by means of a merciful covenant. This narrative is applied as an invitation to accept Christ as the sole door to salvation through the question, "Are you in the ark?" Moreover, the interpretation that the flood was global in scope is often emphasized, asserting that God's promise is not limited to mere local floods. This highlights the universal impact of sin and the comprehensive nature of God's judgment and promise. 4. Comparison of Catholic and Protestant interpretations of Genesis chapter 8. While both the Catholic and Protestant churches share many common understandings in their interpretations of Genesis chapter 8, differences are observed in specific theological emphases. Both traditions emphasize God's sovereignty, faithfulness, and mercy, but with different nuances in their expression and application. The table below illustrates a comparison of their interpretations on key themes.